In March of 2023, a retired schoolteacher in rural Georgia plugged a small plastic box into her kitchen wall outlet. It cost her $49. It had a single green LED light, a picture of a lightning bolt on the front, and a promise printed on the box in bold letters. Save up to 90% on your electricity bill. 6 weeks later, her electricity bill had not changed by a single cent. But something else had changed. The plastic casing of that little box had begun to warp from heat. When a volunteer firefighter who lived next door stopped by for coffee, he noticed the smell, that unmistakable scent of melting plastic, and pulled the device from the wall. He cracked it open on her kitchen table. Inside, he found a cheap capacitor the size of a thumbnail, a wire fuse, a resistor, and that green LED light. To add weight and make it feel like a serious piece of technology, the manufacturer had filled the remaining cavity with sand. Sand. That retired schoolteacher's story is not unique. Right now, across YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, millions of people are watching slickly produced videos making an even bolder claim: that a simple spool of copper wire, $3 from any hardware store, wrapped around your home's main power line for 4 minutes, can neutralize a hidden, phantom current that utility companies have been secretly billing you for over a century. Today, on Oracle Prime, we are going to trace this lie all the way to its roots. We are going to travel from a modern Amazon listing back to the gas-lit streets of 1880s London. We are going to crack open the actual physics, expose the economic machinery behind the scam, and then do something none of those viral videos will ever do. We are going to show you what actually works. Not gadgets, not gimmicks, but real knowledge, some of it thousands of years old, that can genuinely reduce your dependence on the grid. Let's begin. Part 1. The Grain of Truth. What is reactive power? Every effective lie is built on a foundation of truth, and the copper coil scam is no exception. To understand why millions of intelligent people fall for it, you need to understand a real concept in electrical engineering: reactive power. Here is the simplest way to think about it. Imagine you are at a bar and you order a pint of beer. The bartender slides it across the counter and you look down at your glass. About 80% of it is golden, beautiful liquid. That is the part that quenches your thirst. But the top 20% is foam. It takes up space, it was part of the pour, but it does absolutely nothing for your thirst. In your home's electrical system, real power, measured in watts, is the liquid. It is the energy that actually performs work. It heats your water, spins your washing machine drum, illuminates your reading lamp. This is what you use. Reactive power is the foam. It is measured in a unit called volt-amperes reactive, or VARs. Certain appliances in your home, particularly anything with an electric motor, like your refrigerator compressor, your ceiling fan, or your air conditioning unit, need this reactive power to generate the magnetic fields required for their motors to spin. This power does not get consumed. It oscillates back and forth between your home and the grid, like a pendulum swinging endlessly. It does no useful work for you, but it occupies space on the electrical lines. Now together, the liquid and the foam make up what engineers call apparent power, the total capacity the utility has to generate and transmit to your neighborhood. Here is where the scammers insert their lie. They claim, with confident narration, slick graphics, and dramatic music, that your home electricity meter is blindly measuring and billing you for the entire glass. Liquid and foam. They tell you that by wrapping a $3 coil of copper wire around your main service cable, you create an opposing magnetic field that cancels the foam, tricks your meter into spinning slower, and saves you thousands of dollars a year. It sounds like genius. It sounds like rebellion against a greedy corporation. It has the thrilling feel of forbidden knowledge. But to understand why it is completely provably wrong, we need to go back 137 years to a young engineer and a dark, ambitious city. Part 2. Sebastian de Ferranti and the birth of the grid. The year is 1887. London is the largest city on Earth, a sprawling 4 million soul metropolis choking on coal smoke, flickering by gaslight, and desperately searching for a cleaner source of illumination. Electricity exists, but it is new, terrifying, and unreliable. Thomas Edison has built small, direct current stations in New York, but they can only power homes within a mile of the generator. The idea of long-distance electrical power is still considered science fiction. Enter Sebastian Ziani de Ferranti. Born in Liverpool in 1864 to an Italian photographer father and an English concert pianist mother, Ferranti was what we would today call a prodigy. At 13, he built an arc lamp for street lighting. At 16, he designed an AC generator with help from Sir William Thomson, the future Lord Kelvin, and patented the device. By the time he was 23, the London Electric Supply Corporation hired him to do something no one had ever attempted: design a power station that could light the entire city from a single location, 8 miles away from its customers. The site chosen was Deptford, on the south bank of the Thames, on a piece of land that once belonged to the East India Company. What Ferranti designed there was nothing short of revolutionary. His Deptford power station would generate alternating current at the unprecedented pressure of 10,000 volts, 4 times what anyone had dared before, and transmit it through underground cables to substations across London, where transformers would step it down for consumer use. Because there was a 10% voltage drop over the cable run, Ferranti set his generating voltage at 11,000 volts to ensure 10,000 arrived at the other end. That is why, to this day, national transmission voltages around the world are standardized in multiples of 11. The 23-year-old engineer's practical workaround became a permanent feature of the global electrical grid. But during the installation of those underground cables, Ferranti noticed something strange. Under very light load, when almost no one was using electricity, the voltage at the far end of his transmission line was actually higher than the voltage at the generating station. Current was supposed to flow from high to low, from source to load. But here it appeared as though the far end was somehow gaining energy from nowhere. This counterintuitive phenomenon became known as the Ferranti Effect. It happens because long transmission cables, we are talking about lines over 200 kilometers, have significant natural capacitance. Under light load conditions, the capacitive charging current interacts with the line's inductance, creating a voltage rise at the receiving end. Ferranti documented it, engineers studied it, and for more than a century, power grid operators have managed it using shunt reactors and other compensation equipment. And then, in the age of YouTube and TikTok, scammers resurrected Ferranti's name. They took a real, documented phenomenon that occurs on industrial scale, hundreds of kilometers long, high-voltage transmission lines, and told ordinary homeowners that it was happening inside their 20-meter household wiring. They told people that a $3 coil was the cure that Ferranti himself had supposedly discovered, and that power companies had buried it for 130 years. It is a compelling narrative, but it collapses under even the gentlest scrutiny. Part 3. Why the copper coil does absolutely nothing. Let us dismantle this claim with the same precision an engineer would use. Your main power service cable, the one that enters your house from the street, contains at minimum 2 primary conductors, a live wire carrying current in and a neutral wire carrying current back out. In many systems, there is also a ground wire. The current in the live wire and the current in the neutral wire flow in opposite directions. Because of this, their magnetic fields are equal in magnitude, but opposite in direction. They cancel each other out almost entirely. When you wrap a coil of copper wire around the outside of this cable, that coil sits in a space where the net magnetic flux is effectively zero. There is no field to interact with. There is no energy to capture. There is nothing to cancel. You might as well wrap a piece of string around a garden hose and expect it to filter your water. This is not a matter of opinion. This is Faraday's law of electromagnetic induction, one of the most thoroughly tested principles in all of physics. Without a changing magnetic flux passing through a coil, no electromotive force is induced, period. But the scammers rely on the fact that most people have never taken a physics course that covered Faraday's law. They use language that sounds scientific: electromagnetic harmonization, resonance cancellation, phantom current neutralization, and they dress it up with confident narration and before and after screenshots of electricity bills that are trivially easy to fake. Now, let us address the billing claim. The idea that your utility company is charging you for reactive power, the foam in our beer analogy. Here is the verified reality. Residential electricity meters in the United States, Europe, Vietnam, and virtually every country in the world are programmed to measure and bill only real power, only the liquid. You are charged in kilowatt hours, a unit of real energy consumed. Reactive power passes through your meter without being recorded. The US Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency, through their Energy Star program, have been explicit on this point. Their official statement reads, and I want to be precise here, that they have seen no data proving these types of residential devices accomplish what they claim, and that power factor correction devices do not generally improve energy efficiency for homeowners. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the agency of the US Commerce Department responsible for measurement standards, published a detailed technical report, NIST Technical Note 1654, specifically debunking the residential power factor correction myth. Their conclusion is unambiguous. For a typical home, installing a power factor correction capacitor will not reduce your electric bill. Now, and this is important, power factor correction is a real and legitimate technology. In industrial settings, large factories running banks of heavy electric motors generate enormous amounts of reactive power. This extra current flowing through utility lines causes real losses on the grid and forces the utility to build larger infrastructure. So industrial customers are in fact penalized for poor power factor, and they install large, precisely calibrated capacitor banks to correct it. This is established electrical engineering, but your home is not a steel mill. The reactive power drawn by your refrigerator compressor is negligible in the context of the grid. Your utility does not meter it, does not charge you for it, and a $3 coil of wire could not correct it even if they did. Part 4. Inside the box. What scammers actually sell you. If the copper coil trick is the romantic version of this scam, the story of forbidden knowledge and utility company conspiracies, then the plug-in power saver box is the commercial version. Same lie, shinier packaging. These devices retail for anywhere from $30 to $70 under an ever-changing carousel of brand names. Power Factor Saver, Okawatt, Energy Crusher, KVAR Energy Controller, Watt Rescue, Voltex. They rebrand constantly because each name eventually accumulates enough negative reviews and consumer complaints that it becomes toxic. A new name, a new website, a new round of Facebook ads, and the cycle begins again. Engineers, consumer protection journalists, and electrical hobbyists around the world have purchased and disassembled dozens of these devices. The findings are remarkably consistent. Inside, you will typically find a small polypropylene or metallized film capacitor rated at a fraction of a microfarad, a cheap wire fuse, a metal oxide varistor, and the green LED light that serves as the device's entire proof of function. In some units, the capacitor is not even fully connected to the circuit. The LED is the only component actually drawing power. And here is the darkest irony. That LED light consumes electricity, The device you bought to save money on your power bill is, in a small but measurable way, increasing your power bill. You are paying to watch a green light glow. But the consequences can be far worse than wasted money. These devices are almost universally manufactured in facilities with no quality control certifications, no UL listing, no CE marking, no safety testing of any kind. The capacitors inside can overheat, especially in homes with voltage fluctuations. Consumer reports from across the globe have documented units with warped casings, melted internals, and scorch marks on the wall outlets they were plugged into. The Federal Trade Commission issued a formal notice as far back as 1979, its Notice of Penalty Offences concerning energy-saving claims, declaring it an unfair and deceptive act to represent energy savings that consumers will not ordinarily realize. More recently, the FTC has taken enforcement action against manufacturers of bogus fuel-saving and insulation products making similar unsubstantiated claims. In countries like Vietnam, the legal consequences can be even more direct. Under current electrical safety regulations, tampering with grid measurement equipment or using interference devices on your electrical supply can result in heavy fines and criminal prosecution for theft of electricity and public endangerment. So why do people still buy these things? Why has this particular scam been so resilient? The answer has less to do with physics and more to do with psychology. Part 5. Why we fall for it. The psychology of energy anxiety. We live in an age of extraordinary dependence. Think about it for a moment. If the electrical grid in your city shut down completely for 72 hours, just 3 days, what would happen? Your refrigerator stops. Within 12 hours, perishable food begins to spoil. Your water supply, in most modern buildings, relies on electric pumps. No power, no water pressure above the ground floor. Your phone dies within a day. Your ability to regulate your body temperature, whether through air conditioning in summer or electric heating in winter, vanishes completely. Traffic lights go dark. Gas stations cannot pump fuel. ATMs are offline. Medical equipment that millions of people depend on simply stops. 3 days without electricity and modern society begins to fracture. We know this. We feel this vulnerability in our bones, even if we never articulate it. And when we open our electricity bill and see the numbers climbing, month after month, year after year, that vulnerability transforms into anxiety. And anxiety makes us susceptible. The copper coil scam and the power saver box scam are not selling a product. They are selling relief from anxiety. They are selling the feeling of having found a secret, a loophole, a hack, a piece of forbidden knowledge that the powerful do not want you to have. That emotional payload is what makes the scam so effective. The $3 coil of wire is almost beside the point. What you are really buying is a story about yourself, a story in which you are clever, resourceful, and one step ahead of the system. This is exactly the emotional architecture that con artists have exploited for centuries, and understanding it is the first step toward genuine independence. Because here is the question that truly matters. If the scam does not work, what does? Part 6. What actually works? Ancient wisdom meets modern science. The real path to energy independence is not dramatic. It does not involve wrapping anything around your power line. It does not require a single viral video. But it is profoundly effective, and much of it was figured out thousands of years before anyone had heard the word electricity. Let us start with the single largest drain on your electricity bill: heating and cooling. In most homes, climate control accounts for 40 to 60% of total energy consumption. Every dollar you save here is a dollar you save on the most expensive line item on your bill. Our ancestors understood this instinctively. In the Middle East, for over 1,000 years, builders constructed structures called bajirs, windcatchers. These were tall, elegant towers built on the rooftops of homes in cities like Yazd, in modern-day Iran, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 45 degrees Celsius. The Bajir captures the faintest breeze at elevation, channels it down through the building, sometimes passing it over an underground pool of water or a subterranean channel called a qanat. The air is cooled by evaporation, pulled through the living spaces, and exhausted through openings on the opposite side. No compressor, no refrigerant, no electricity, just a deep understanding of thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and the properties of evaporative cooling. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans engineered the hypocaust system. Floors were raised on pillars of stacked tiles, and hot air from a central furnace, fueled by wood, was channeled beneath the floor and through hollow walls. The massive thermal mass of the stone floors absorbed heat slowly and radiated it evenly for hours after the fire had died. The Roman engineers did not fight nature. They collaborated with it, using the physics of thermal mass and radiant heat transfer. You can apply these exact same principles today without a single Roman architect. Seal the thermal envelope of your home. This means identifying and closing every gap where conditioned air escapes, around windows, doors, electrical outlets on exterior walls, attic hatches, and where pipes penetrate walls. The US Department of Energy estimates that air leaks account for 25 to 30% of a typical home's heating and cooling energy use. A tube of silicone cork costs $4. A pack of weather stripping costs $6. The return on investment dwarfs anything a $49 plastic box could promise. Add insulation to your attic. Heat rises, and in a poorly insulated attic, it rises straight out of your house and into the sky. Proper attic insulation, even basic fiberglass bats, can reduce your heating and cooling costs by 15 to 20%. Use heavy blackout curtains during the hottest part of the day. This is the modern equivalent of the thick mud and stone walls our ancestors built. Those walls had massive thermal inertia. They absorbed the sun's heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night, keeping interior temperatures stable. A good set of thermal curtains does the same thing for your windows, which are the weakest point in any home's thermal envelope. Practice passive ventilation. Open your windows at night when the outdoor temperature drops, creating cross breezes that purge accumulated heat from your home structure. In the morning, close the windows and draw the curtains, trapping the cool air inside. This is not a trick, it is basic thermodynamics, and it is free. Now let us talk about something the scam videos never mention: vampire loads. These are the devices in your home that draw real power, real kilowatt hours that appear on your meter, even when they are turned off or in standby mode. Your television, your game console, your microwave display, your phone charger left plugged in with no phone attached, your cable box, your smart speaker. Individually, each draws only a few watts. But collectively, across all the devices in a modern home, vampire loads can account for 5 to 10% of your total electricity consumption. A power strip with an on-off switch costs $8. Plug your entertainment center into one, flip it off when you leave the room, and you have just achieved a real, measurable, honest reduction in your electricity bill. No copper wire, no conspiracy theory, just physics. Part 7. The skills that cannot be unplugged. There is a deeper lesson here, and it goes beyond saving a few dollars on your monthly bill. For most of human history, for tens of thousands of years, people survived, stayed healthy, preserved their food, and maintained hygiene without any access to an electrical grid. They did this not through magic, but through accumulated knowledge passed down across generations. And in our rush to embrace modern convenience, we have lost almost all of it. Consider food preservation. Your electric refrigerator is, at most, about 150 years old as a concept, and became a common household appliance only in the 1930s. Before that, humans preserved food for months and even years through fermentation, salt curing, smoking, and dehydration. Fermentation, the process behind sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, miso, and pickles, is not just preservation, it is applied microbiology. Our ancestors used beneficial bacteria to create an acidic environment that pathogenic bacteria cannot survive in, while simultaneously producing probiotics that strengthen their own gut immunity. You can ferment vegetables on your kitchen counter today with nothing more than a glass jar, salt, water, and thyme. No electricity required. And the result is food that is not only preserved, but nutritionally enhanced, richer in vitamins, easier to digest, and populated with living cultures that modern gastroenterology increasingly recognizes as essential to gut health. Consider water purification. Before electric-powered filtration and UV sterilization systems, people used methods that are still effective today. Slow sand filtration, passing water through layers of sand, gravel, and charcoal, removes pathogens through a combination of physical straining and biological activity. A biofilm of beneficial microorganisms forms on the surface layer of sand and actively consumes harmful bacteria. Solar water disinfection, known as the SODIS method, uses ultraviolet radiation from direct sunlight to kill pathogens in clear plastic bottles over a period of 6 to 8 hours. The World Health Organization has endorsed this method for emergency water treatment in regions without access to modern infrastructure. Consider hygiene and disease prevention. Long before we understood germ theory, ancient cultures had developed remarkably effective sanitation practices. Sunlight was used as a disinfectant. Bedding, clothing, and food preparation surfaces were systematically exposed to direct sunlight, which we now know destroys bacteria and viruses through UV radiation. Copper and brass vessels were used to store drinking water across cultures from ancient Egypt to the Indian subcontinent. Modern science has confirmed what these civilizations knew through experience. Copper exhibits what is called the oligodynamic effect. It is inherently toxic to a wide range of bacteria, viruses, and fungi on contact. A study published in the journal Applied and Environmental Microbiology found that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19, survived for up to 72 hours on plastic and stainless steel surfaces, but was inactivated on copper surfaces within just 4 hours. Our ancestors cleaned with ash, salt, and naturally derived lye, alkaline substances that break down the lipid membranes of pathogens. They did not have branded disinfectant sprays, but they had chemistry. Every one of these skills, fermentation, water purification, passive cooling, solar disinfection, natural cleaning, is available to you right now. They require no subscription, no monthly payment, no electrical outlet. They cannot be taken away by a power outage or a price hike. And when you possess these skills, something fundamental shifts in your psychology. The anxiety that makes you vulnerable to scams begins to dissolve. You stop scrolling desperately through social media looking for a miracle device to rescue you from your electricity bill. You stop operating from a place of fear, because you genuinely know, that even if the grid went dark tomorrow, you would not be helpless. That knowledge is worth infinitely more than a $3 spool of copper wire. Part 8. A word of honest balance. Before we close, I want to do something that scam videos and even many debunking videos never do. I want to be honest about the limits of everything I have just told you. The ancestral techniques I described, passive cooling, fermentation, solar water treatment, are real, effective, and time-tested. But they are not magic, and they are not replacements for modern infrastructure in every situation. If you live in a region where summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, and you have elderly family members or young children, passive cooling alone may not be sufficient to prevent heat-related illness. Air conditioning saves lives, that is a fact. If your water source is contaminated with heavy metals, chemical pollutants, or industrial runoff, sand filtration and solar disinfection will not remove those contaminants. You need activated carbon filters or reverse osmosis systems, technologies that require manufactured components. If you have a serious medical condition that requires electrically powered equipment, a CPAP machine, a home dialysis unit, a powered wheelchair, your dependence on the grid is not a psychological weakness. It is a medical reality, and you should plan accordingly with backup power solutions. The goal is not to reject modern technology. The goal is to stop being helpless without it. There is a critical difference. Professional energy audits, many of which utilities offer free of charge, can identify specific inefficiencies in your home that generic advice cannot. A qualified electrician can assess your home's wiring for genuine safety issues. These professionals provide real value. The scammers who sell you a $3 coil or a $49 box are not just failing to provide value, they are actively delaying your pursuit of solutions that actually work. Conclusion. Let me take you back to that kitchen in rural Georgia. A retired schoolteacher living on a fixed income spent $49 she could not easily afford on a plastic box filled with sand and a green LED light. She waited 6 weeks for a miracle that was never going to come. The scam did not succeed because she was foolish. She is not. It succeeded because the scam was designed with surgical precision to exploit her exact situation. The anxiety of rising bills, the complexity of electrical systems she was never taught to understand, and the deeply human desire to believe that a simple solution exists for a complicated problem. The internet is full of beautifully produced deceptions, copper coils that do nothing, plastic boxes filled with sand, viral videos with millions of views and zero scientific merit. They thrive because we live in an age where information is abundant, but understanding is scarce. But you are watching this video, and that means you have already taken the most important step. You chose to look deeper. You chose to question the easy answer. And now you have something that no scammer can take from you: clarity. The real power was never in a $3 coil of wire. It was never in a plug-in box with a green light. The real power is in understanding how your home actually works, how your ancestors solved the same fundamental problems you face today, and how to build genuine resilience. One sealed window, one fermented jar, one deliberate choice at a time. This is Oracle Prime. Question the easy answers. Learn the skills that cannot be unplugged. And the next time someone tells you that a $3 piece of copper wire will cut your electricity bill in half, you will know exactly what to say. Thank you for watching. If this journey opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.